This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a message.
I came home expecting the usual quiet street, trimmed lawns, polite waves, nothing out of place. Instead, I found deep scratches carved across the side of my Humvee, fresh enough to still catch the light. Someone had decided it didn't belong there. Someone who thought it was just a truck. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message, a line crossed. And the person who crossed it had no idea what they just triggered, or how badly a single act of entitlement was about to backfire. Because when you touch the wrong property in the wrong neighborhood, the story doesn't end with a scratch, it begins there. Before any lines were crossed, before tempers flared or rules were weaponized, life in the neighborhood moved at a predictable, almost scripted pace. The kind of place where lawns were measured by inches, paint colors were quietly judged, and every mailbox looked like it had been approved by committee. It was marketed as peaceful, orderly, and well-managed, the kind of community people moved into because they wanted fewer problems, not more. I had moved there for exactly that reason. Stability. Quiet. A sense that after long days, home would feel like neutral ground. I wasn't looking to stand out. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I followed the rules, paid the fees on time, waved back when neighbors waved first. I kept my property clean, my trash bins hidden, my lights within regulation brightness. On paper, I was the kind of resident HOAs claimed to want. The Humvee came later. It wasn't new. It wasn't flashy in the way sports cars were flashy. It was solid, heavy, and unmistakable, the kind of vehicle that looked like it had a history even when parked and silent. To me, it wasn't a symbol. It was practical, reliable, something I had worked toward and taken care of, the same way someone else might take care of a boat or a restored classic car. It stayed parked neatly in my driveway, never blocking sidewalks, never leaking oil, never violating any posted restriction. At first, it barely registered with most people. A few looks. A few double takes. Nothing more. But neighborhoods like that have a way of sharpening attention over time. What starts as curiosity quietly turns into judgment. And judgment, when paired with authority, even small authority, becomes something else entirely. The HOA itself had a reputation long before I ever crossed paths with it. Officially, it existed to preserve community standards. Unofficially, everyone knew there were certain personalities who took those standards personally. People who treated the rulebook less like guidelines and more like a weapon waiting to be used. Most residents avoided conflict by blending in, keeping their heads down, and never giving anyone a reason to look twice. I didn't realize how visible I'd become. It started subtly. Notices about unrelated issues. General reminders sent to everyone, but somehow always timed right after the Humvee had been parked a little longer than usual. Comments during community walkthroughs that lingered just a bit too long near my driveway. The feeling that someone somewhere was watching, not out of concern, but of irritation. Still, nothing direct. Nothing actionable. Just enough to create a sense that the calm surface of the neighborhood was thinner than it looked. And then there was her. Every HOA has someone like her. The person who seems to know every rule by memory, who speaks with absolute certainty even when no one asked. She wasn't loud in the traditional sense, but she was ever present, walking the neighborhood at precise times, clipboard or phone always in hand, eyes scanning for deviations. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew who she was. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a shared space. It was territory. I noticed the way her attention lingered on the Humvee longer than anyone else's. Not curiosity, calculation. The kind of look that wasn't asking why, but how long until this is dealt with. She never said anything to me directly. Not at first. Instead, the pressure came indirectly, through rules that suddenly felt less abstract and more personal. Vehicle restrictions. Aesthetic clauses. Vague language about commercial appearance and visual harmony. Rules written broadly enough to be interpreted however someone wanted, if they wanted badly enough. I still believed, at that point, that logic would prevail. That if something were truly an issue, it would be handled properly. Notices, conversations, process. I didn't see what was coming because I assumed the system, flawed as it might be, still operated within some basic boundaries. I was wrong. What I didn't know was that the Humvee had already become more than a parked vehicle in her mind. It had become a challenge. A symbol of defiance she'd invented on my behalf. And when someone like that decides something doesn't belong, they don't wait for permission. They act. And the neighborhood that once felt quiet and controlled was already sliding toward a moment that would tear that illusion apart, one scratch at a time. The first real sign that something had shifted came not with confrontation, but with paper. A notice appeared taped neatly to my door one afternoon, the kind printed on official letterhead meant to feel heavier than it was. It referenced community standards, vehicle appearance, and vague language about long-term driveway storage. No direct accusation. No clear violation. Just enough ambiguity to make it unsettling. The Humvee wasn't named outright, but it didn't need to be. There was nothing else on my property that could possibly apply. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to find the part where it clearly stated I'd done something wrong. It wasn't there. Instead, it relied on implication, the assumption that I'd recognize myself as the problem and quietly fix it. I didn't respond right away. Part of me assumed this was posturing, a soft warning meant to nudge rather than punish. I kept doing what I'd always done. Parked the vehicle properly. Followed every written rule to the letter. If someone was watching closely, I gave them nothing to point at. That's when the reminders escalated. Emails followed. Then follow-ups to those emails. Each one more specific than the last, but still carefully avoiding anything that could be challenged outright. The language shifted from neutral to firm, from informational to corrective. Phrases like, continued noncompliance may result in penalties, began to appear, despite no explanation of what noncompliance actually meant. What made it worse was how selectively the rules were applied. Other residents had RVs parked for days after trips. Trailers appeared during renovations. Work trucks lined driveways during weekends. None of them received notices. None of them were flagged. The enforcement, it became clear, had a focal point. Mine. I started paying closer attention to patterns. The timing of inspections. The frequency of HOA walkthroughs. The way certain people seemed to know when I wasn't home. The way her presence always coincided with new correspondence. Still, there was no direct accusation. No conversation. Just pressure. Then came the fine. It arrived without warning, listed as a temporary visual compliance violation. The amount wasn't devastating, but it wasn't symbolic either. It was just enough to sting. Enough to say, we can do this whenever we want. I appealed it. I followed the process exactly as outlined. Submitted photos. Cited the bylaws. Highlighted the absence of any specific prohibition against my vehicle. I expected, at the very least, a discussion. Maybe a hearing. Something resembling fairness. What I got instead was silence. Weeks passed. The fine remained. Then another notice arrived, referencing the unpaid balance and adding a late fee. It was as if my appeal had never existed. That was the moment frustration began to harden into something else. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply pushing the machinery forward until it matched her expectations. The rules weren't being enforced. They were being shaped. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted too. Subtle at first. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. Conversations stopped when I walked past. Rumors move faster than facts in places like that, and it didn't take long for the narrative to change. The Humvee wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was an issue. And issues, in HOA culture, are contagious. Another fine followed. Then another. Each one cited a slightly different rationale. Each one carefully vague. None of them consistent. It became impossible not to see the strategy. Overwhelm, exhaust, force compliance through attrition. I requested a formal meeting. The response came quickly this time. A date was set. A time slot assigned. 15 minutes. I arrived prepared. Documentation. Printed bylaws. A clear timeline. I expected resistance, but I also expected logic to matter once everything was laid out. It didn't. The meeting felt less like a discussion and more like a performance. The rules were referenced selectively. Questions were redirected. Responsibility was diffused. Every attempt to pin down a concrete violation was met with generalized language about community expectations. The Humvee, I was told, created concern. Concern wasn't defined. It didn't need to be. I left that meeting knowing something fundamental had broken. Not just in the relationship, but in the illusion that process offered protection. From that point on, every interaction carried an edge. The fines continued. So did the scrutiny. Photos were taken of my driveway. Measurements were suddenly relevant. Time limits appeared where none had existed before. Notices arrived citing rules I couldn't find in the actual documentation. When I pointed that out, the language shifted again, reframing the issue as discretionary enforcement. And always, hovering behind it all, was her. I'd see her walking past my house more often now. Slowing down. Looking. Sometimes stopping outright. Never speaking. Never acknowledging me directly. Just observing, as if waiting for something to justify what she already intended to do. I began documenting everything. Every notice. Every fine. Every inconsistency. Patterns emerged quickly once I started looking. Dates lined up too neatly. Enforcement spiked whenever she was most active. Rules were bent in ways that benefited no one except her sense of control. The tension reached a point where I dreaded coming home. Not because of the vehicle, but because of the uncertainty. Would there be another notice? Another fine? Another escalation? And then, one afternoon, I came home to silence. No notice on the door. No email waiting. Just the Humvee sitting exactly where I'd left it. For a brief moment, I wondered if the pressure had finally worked its way out. If she'd moved on. If the fixation had burned itself out. I walked closer. That's when I saw the scratches. Deep. Deliberate. Running along the side panel in long, uneven lines. Not accidental. Not a careless bump. This was damage done with intent. With time. With anger. The message was no longer implied. It was carved into metal. In that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. What had been bureaucratic harassment crossed into something unmistakably personal. And whoever had done it hadn't just enforced a rule. They'd committed a mistake that couldn't be filed away, ignored, or quietly paid off. Because this wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about accountability. And the person who thought they were acting with impunity had just stepped into territory where the rules changed completely. The moment I fully understood what had happened, the neighborhood felt different. Not quieter, sharper. The scratches on the Humvee weren't random. They followed deliberate lines, deep enough to cut through paint and primer, etched with enough force to leave no doubt about intent. This wasn't frustration taken out in a moment of carelessness. This was someone standing there long enough to decide, repeatedly, to keep going. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring. Not shocked. Focused. Because something had finally crossed from administrative pressure into criminal action. And once that line is crossed, everything changes. I didn't touch the vehicle. I didn't try to assess the damage beyond what was obvious. I didn't let emotion take over. I documented it. Photos from every angle. Close-ups showing depth. Wide shots showing location. Time stamps. Context. The same methodical approach I'd been forced to adopt for months now became something else. A record not of inconvenience, but of evidence. The irony wasn't lost on me. After weeks of being told about community standards and appearance concerns, the worst visual damage in the neighborhood now sat plainly in my driveway, caused not by neglect, but by enforcement obsession. The response was immediate once the process shifted. A police report transformed the situation from an internal HOA matter into a documented act of vandalism. The tone changed overnight. What had once been brushed aside as discretionary enforcement now carried legal weight. Insurance got involved. Investigators asked questions that couldn't be redirected or softened with vague language. Intent mattered. Motive mattered. And suddenly, the same people who had spoken confidently about rules became cautious about responsibility. Security footage from nearby homes began to surface. Not because anyone was eager to help before, but because once something became serious, neutrality evaporated. Cameras don't care about HOA hierarchies. They don't respond to pressure. They capture what happens when no one thinks they're being watched. The footage wasn't dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. It was worse. Methodical. A figure stopping, looking around, leaning in. Repeated motions. No rush. No hesitation. Just certainty. There was no mistaking who it was. The person who had spent months enforcing rules now appeared in footage breaking them. The same presence that had lingered near my driveway during inspections was now caught doing something that couldn't be explained away as concern or authority. There was no interpretation left. Only action. Once that evidence entered the conversation, the power dynamic collapsed. The HOA, which had been comfortable issuing fines and notices, found itself scrambling to distance from individual behavior. Statements softened. Emails shifted tone. The same organization that had insisted on strict compliance now emphasized that it did not condone personal actions taken outside official capacity. It was too late for that. Because the damage wasn't just to the vehicle. It was to credibility. Insurance estimates came back higher than expected. The scratches had gone deeper than surface damage. Panels required refinishing. The cost climbed quickly, and with it, the seriousness of the consequences. What might have been dismissed as a petty act now carried financial weight that couldn't be ignored. Then came the legal implications. Vandalism isn't abstract when it's documented. It doesn't disappear because someone holds a position. It doesn't care how familiar a name is on HOA emails. The same system that had been used to pressure residents now applied in reverse. Methodically, impersonally, and without regard for status. The shift in the neighborhood was immediate and unmistakable. People who had avoided eye contact suddenly paid attention. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, then openly. The story spread, but not in the distorted way rumors usually do. This time, it came with proof. The narrative flipped. What had once been framed as a troublesome homeowner now looked like targeted harassment that had spiraled out of control. The HOA held an emergency meeting. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about liability. About optics. About damage control. Decisions that had been deferred for months were suddenly made quickly. Fines tied to the vehicle were quietly withdrawn. Notices stopped arriving. Enforcement priorities shifted elsewhere with remarkable speed. The person at the center of it all vanished from visibility. No more walkthroughs. No more hovering. No more presence near my property. Her authority, once exercised confidently, now came under scrutiny from the very system she'd used to wield it. Positions built on perceived control tend to crumble fast when exposed to accountability. What struck me most wasn't the speed of the collapse. It was how fragile it had been all along. The power she'd relied on wasn't backed by anything substantial. It worked only as long as no one pushed back, documented patterns, or forced the situation into a space where evidence mattered more than perception. Standing in my driveway days later, looking at the Humvee waiting for repairs, I realized how close the situation had come to going unchecked. How easily it could have remained a quiet, grinding pressure that ended with compliance instead of exposure. The scratches would be repaired. The vehicle would be restored. But the image of authority being stripped away, that would linger. Because the real damage wasn't done to metal. It was done to the illusion that some people can act without consequence simply because they believe they're entitled to enforce order. And once that illusion breaks, there's no easy way to put it back together. What followed wasn't loud or explosive. There were no public apologies. No dramatic scenes. Just a sudden absence of power where it had once been concentrated, and a community forced to confront how close it had come to letting control replace fairness. The quiet that returned afterward wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was heavier. And it carried a lesson that no set of bylaws could ever fully erase. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood settled into a strange kind of calm, not the polished, artificial calm it once had, but something more cautious and real. The kind that comes after a line has been crossed and everyone quietly agrees not to pretend it didn't happen. The Humvee went in for repairs. Panels were sanded down, repainted, restored to the condition they'd been in before someone decided to make a point with a key. Insurance handled the costs, and responsibility landed exactly where it belonged. There were no loopholes left to hide behind. No committees to deflect blame. No carefully worded emails that could soften what had already been proven. What changed most wasn't the vehicle. It was the balance of power. The HOA didn't announce anything publicly, but its behavior shifted overnight. Enforcement notices became rare. Language in emails softened. Rules that had once been wielded aggressively were suddenly interpreted conservatively. The discretionary clauses, the ones that had allowed personal irritation to masquerade as governance, were quietly avoided. Positions were restructured. Oversight increased. The same organization that once insisted everything was by the book now took great care to ensure every decision could survive scrutiny. And she didn't disappear entirely, but she was no longer what she'd been. No more authority. No more visible control. No more confidence that rules existed to serve her interpretation alone. The neighborhood noticed. People always do. Power, once lost, leaves a vacuum that can't be filled by silence. Neighbors who had kept their distance before slowly returned to normalcy. Conversations resumed. A few quiet apologies surfaced, not spoken directly, but expressed through changed behavior. People waved again. Some even stopped to ask about the repairs, about how things were going, about whether it was finally over. It was. But not in the way I'd expected when the whole ordeal began. The real resolution wasn't revenge or humiliation. It was exposure. The kind that forces systems to confront their weaknesses and people to confront themselves. The situation didn't end with shouting or dramatic declarations. It ended with accountability. And that, in a place built on control, was far more disruptive than noise ever could be. Looking back, the most unsettling part wasn't the scratches or the fines or even the months of pressure. It was how easily the behavior had been normalized. How many people had quietly accepted it because challenging authority felt harder than living under it. How thin the line is between community standards and personal vendetta when no one asks questions. The Humvee had been called just a truck. But it had become something else entirely. A mirror. One that reflected how quickly entitlement escalates when it's left unchecked, and how fragile that entitlement becomes once evidence enters the room. The neighborhood never returned to what it had been before. And that was a good thing. Because beneath the manicured lawns and uniform facades, something important had been corrected. A reminder that rules don't exist to serve egos. That authority without accountability is just intimidation dressed up as order. And that silence, while comfortable, often protects the wrong people. So the question isn't whether the scratches were worth it. The question is this: how many people are still being quietly pressured in places just like this, and what would happen if one moment finally forced the truth into the open? Because sometimes, all it takes is one mistake by the wrong person to expose everything.